Wayne Motts is Chief Executive Officer for the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. He has been a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg for 28 years and is the co-author, with James Hessler, of Picketts Charge at Gettysburg, a guide to the most famous attack in American history. James Hessler is a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park. In 2009, his book, Sickles at Gettysburg, was awarded the Batchelder Coddington Award and Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable's Distinguished Book Award as the most outstanding work on the Gettysburg campaign. He is a popular author and speaker at Civil War Roundtables and has taught courses for the Gettysburg Foundation and Harrisburg Area Community College. Please join me in welcoming Wayne Motts and Jim Hessler.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris, for that lovely introduction. Well, I'm not Wayne Motts. I'm Jim Hessler, and I'm going to start the talk today. And as advertised, we are going to, I think somewhat appropriately, wrap up this year's Sacred Trust by talking about what really is the grand climax of the Battle of Gettysburg, Picketts Charge. Title of a book that Wayne and I wrote that was published last year, and we're going to tell you some of our favorite stories from that book. Now, as Chris said in the introduction, Wayne and I are both licensed battlefield guides here at Gettysburg, something that, quite frankly, we're both very proud of. And it occurred to us that, nobody had ever really published or produced a detailed tour guide to Picketts Charge. So the talk today is going to be structured somewhat like our book, in that we really think the best tours focus on both the big picture of the charge and the small picture, the human interest stories. So I'm going to come up first. I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture and some of Lee's grand strategy and why we remember Picketts Charge. And then Wayne will come up with a few personal human interest stories that we think you guys are going to enjoy. So, and maybe you've even heard this said this weekend, some scholars would tell us that there is nothing more left to learn about Gettysburg. In fact, we have a quote up on screen. So much has been said and written about the Battle of Gettysburg that it would seem that little of interest could be added. Well, folks, that quote dates back to 1887. The author of that quote, Colonel Richard Penn Smith, actually defended the famous angle on July 3rd at Gettysburg as part of the 71st Pennsylvania. So, this idea that there's really nothing new to talk about with Gettysburg, fortunately, is not a new phenomenon. And, we always laugh at that quote, and Wayne and I often wonder what Smith would think if he were with us today and he could see all of the books, the magazines, the social media forums, the blogs that have come out since 1887. What would Smith and others like this think? Would the Civil War veterans today even know what Facebook is? I doubt it. So no, the Civil War didn't quite change everything. But in one of our very first book signings, a gentleman came up to Wayne and I, and we still kind of laugh about this. A gentleman came up to us and kind of looked at the cover of our book and said, another Gettysburg book, another Picketts Charge book. I want to see more books on the Peninsula Campaign. And Wayne and I kind of smiled politely and said, well, sir, you can go on and write more books about the Peninsula Campaign. We're going to continue to talk about the Gettysburg Campaign because it's something that speaks to both of us and obviously speaks to all of you because we have a full tent here on a very late and sweltering Sunday afternoon in July. The reality is every generation we think really needs to learn and rediscover the men and the stories of Picketts Charge. So if we can kind of establish that Gettysburg still has a lot to tell us, then why do we still do Picketts Charge? I hate to use the term popular, for obviously a horrific battle, but it's still, for lack of a better word, Picketts Charge still is the most popular action here at the Battle of Gettysburg. And that was something, it's a part of the battle that still resonates with people. At the very earliest reunions, this was something that the veterans themselves understood. They understood that image of North and South veterans shaking hands over that stone wall on Cemetery Ridge was the perfect way to demonstrate the unity of the North and South. So Picketts Charge has, for nearly 150 years now, really represented Gettysburg Gettysburg to a lot of people. And that continues, the veterans are long gone, but that continues even into our own troubled times. And what you're looking at on screen right now is a picture from the 150th anniversary of the charge on July 3rd, 2013. How many people, just show of hands, how many people think they might be in that picture? There you go. A lot of hands going up in the tent. Yeah, ironically, 20,000 people made the charge that day, more than were in the actual assault itself. And Wayne and I are in that picture. We are like on the far right of the Meade equestrian statue, so we can join you there. So, 20,000 people, July 3rd, 2013. They didn't go to Culp's Hill. They didn't go, they didn't go to the peach orchard, but they show up en masse for Pickett's Charge. And that says something about both the, the power that this famous assault still has on people. But in keeping with the theme of change, which has been the Sacred Trust theme this weekend, obviously we would talk about from a military point of view, Wayne and I do both strongly believe that yes, it is the assault of July 3rd, Pickett's Charge, that is the turning point of the battle. It is the moment at Gettysburg following the failure of this assault that Robert E. Lee and his lieutenants realize they no longer have the strength and the ability to carry Cemetery Ridge. July 2nd is very important, but in Wayne and our view, it is really July 3rd that is the turning point. It is the moment that causes Lee to disengage. So, again, keeping in with this theme, Pickett's Charge really is the moment at Gettysburg that, in our view, changes everything. So, and let me pause for a minute because I know we're live streaming and this may show up on YouTube at a later date. We are, by using the term Pickett's Charge, we are not in any way trying to denigrate the participation of the men who fought under Pettigrew and Trimble. The Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble assault is really what it is, but we tend to use the more popularly coined term Pickett's Charge, which is of course what history has remembered it as. So please, those of you on the internet, save your complaints. I assure you, Pettigrew and Trimble are very much involved in the stories that Wayne and I told. But anyway, so back to the point. So what we have on screen here, Lee's military secretary, Armstead Long. Now, Long wrote in the 1880s that the attack of Pickett's division has been more criticized and is still less understood than any other act of the Gettysburg drama. It was not ordered without mature consideration and on grounds that presented fair prospects of success. Long wrote those words in the 1880s, and once again, we would argue that those words still ring true today. Probably been more criticized and less understood than any aspect of the Battle of Gettysburg. So I will ask you once again for a show of hands, and please feel free to raise your hand if you're watching at home. How many of you have been here at Gettysburg, stood at the Virginia Memorial, looked out across that open 1 mile of ground, thought about Lee's men crossing that open ground? How many of you have done that and shook your head? Right, exactly. I had, even just yesterday, I had two gentlemen on a battlefield tour yesterday. They had never been to Gettysburg before, took them to the Virginia Memorial, showed them that, and they laughed and they shook their head. It's kind of a universal notion. So we've sort of developed this concept that General Lee and others must have been, at the very least, off of their game to order what would appear to be such a suicidal assault on the afternoon of July 3rd. But if you step back for a minute and you realize General Lee's track record and his obvious intelligence in managing battlefields, you can kind of step back and say, is it possible that Long is right? Is it possible that we still don't really understand the July 3rd charge? Are there still things we can get out of it, to try to help and understand that maybe, just maybe, the charge as it was pulled off was not the charge that Robert E. Lee envisioned? And if you can try to think of that, it will then all of us as students of the Battle of Gettysburg help us better understand that. So, let's rewind a little bit and just try to understand, first of all, when July 3rd rolls around, why should Robert E. Lee even attack to begin with? Well, he has a couple of options. He can retreat, he can keep his army here for another day and do nothing, or he can attack. The notion of retreating up to this point does not seem to enter into Lee's mind. Lee in his battle reports will tell us that he still found it too difficult to withdraw through the mountains with his trains. So retreating is not, in Lee's mind at this point, not an option. Sitting here and doing nothing is not an option, which ultimately then still leaves the third and final option of attacking. And should Lee attack? Is it logical to attack? The answer is yes, it is. So July 1st, remember Lee's army had scored an unexpected victory north and west of Gettysburg. Lee had wrote that encouraged by the successful results of July 1st, it was thought advisable to continue the attack on July 2nd. Now on July 2nd, Lee's army is going to launch a series of powerful assaults, primarily directed on the Union left flank in and around the Round Tops, ultimately try to come around and attack the right flank around Culp's Hill too. Lee is not going to gain what he wanted on July 2nd, but Lee does not consider the second day to be a defeat either. In Lee's battle report, Lee refers to the second day as a series of partial successes which encouraged him to continue that assault on the third day. Well, what are the partial successes? Now, if we had a smaller audience, I might ask for a little participation, but I'll help you out here. What are the partial successes? Well, Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet have captured the area in and around the Peach Orchard opposite the Union left, specifically sort of the elevated flat ground along the Emmitsburg Road, which Lee and his lieutenants believe will be an effective artillery platform to assault the more elevated Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge beyond. So that's the primary partial success that Robert E. Lee is thinking of that's going to encourage him to continue the assault on July 3rd. And thus, when July 3rd comes around, Lee starts off by saying that the general plan was unchanged. That probably means Lee's looking at renewing an assault again on the flanks on July 3rd, but as many of us know, Richard Ewell becomes engaged opposite Culp's Hill at about 4:30 a.m. before Longstreet is ready to begin the assault on the Union left. Lee is going to call off any further movements on Longstreet's part, and essentially now Lee is going to look for an alternate attack. So, is Robert E. Lee feeling defeated? No. Does Robert E. Lee necessarily have a reason to retreat and withdraw at this point? No. Does Robert E. Lee have reason to believe that success will be gained and will continue on July 3rd? Yes, he does. Now, all of us with 153 years of hindsight, knowing the outcome, can still shake our head and say, no, he doesn't. But if you step back and you just sort of think about what he knew when he knew it, the decision to continue the offensive on July 3rd still actually makes a lot of sense. Now, the only other thing, though, that I'll add here before we move on is not only is Lee not feeling defeated, but he also does add a passage in his report which is going to be important to understanding how the July 3rd assault comes off. And Lee uses the term in his report. Lee will say that with proper concert of action, Lee does believe further attacks on July 3rd are going to succeed. So remember that term, proper concert of action, because hopefully I'll come back to that again in a few minutes. So we talked about Plan A. Plan A is essentially going in around the flanks. When Ewell becomes engaged before Longstreet is ready, I think Lee realizes that, uncoordinated flank attacks had not worked on the second, so we're going to look for something different. Really, that's something different. What we sometimes refer to as Plan B is going to be the famous Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble assault on Cemetery Ridge later that afternoon. So Lee and Longstreet spent late morning, early afternoon sort of examining the Federal position. Lee will ultimately give Longstreet command of 11 brigades. 8 brigades in A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps and 3 of Longstreet's own under George Pickett to launch this famed assault. Remember that 8 of the 11 brigades are under A.P. Hill. So what does that say about Lee's thinking about Longstreet at this point? If Lee is upset that Longstreet had unnecessarily delayed or performed badly on the second day, it doesn't seem to be reflected in the fact that Lee is once again going to put Longstreet in charge of this assault on the 3rd day. But it's also interesting, too, that the majority of the attack would normally be under General Hill. And does that cause some issues with command and communication and coordination as the day unfolds? Yeah, we think it probably does. So, now what's the objective? Well, it's great to be an armchair general, isn't it? So, Lee has been heavily criticized for attacking the high ground on July 2nd, and now we're going to criticize him for attacking the low ground on July 3rd, which I guess ultimately only leaves no ground as the only option left on the table. But referring again to Armstead Long, who was Lee's military secretary and would have been in a position to know what the old man was thinking, Long once again gives us what Wayne and I think is the most clear, concise description of Lee's plan at Gettysburg on July 3rd. And again, we know a lot of ink has been spilled about this. Is Cemetery Hill the objective? You know, are they going for the flanks again? What's the objective? Wayne and I think that Long gives us the easiest explanation. Now, Long will tell us, and the quote is on screen, that Cemetery Ridge was at every point strongly occupied. There was, however, a weak point upon which an attack could be made with reasonable success. This point was where the ridge, sloping westward, formed the depression through which the Emmetsburg Road passes. Perceiving that by forcing Federal lines at that point and turning towards Cemetery Hill, the Union right would be taken in flank, and the remainder would be neutralized as its fire would be destructive to friend and foe. Generally determined to attack at that point. So again, basically the depression where the Emmetsburg Road and Cemetery Ridge kind of pass through each other. Boys and girls, that's what we have on screen right now, essentially where the attack ends up, in about that mile or so front, running from the Abraham Bryan barn, probably to a little bit down south of the copse of trees. Now, we don't think the copse of trees itself was necessarily a specific target point, but that front that we have on screen, we do think is the objective. If you can cut the Union Army in half at that point, Lee is believing probably that he can basically deal with his inferior numbers by isolating the Union Army into two wings, turn in towards Cemetery Hill, which I would agree is the key to the Union line, but then the Union on the Union left, or what would be the Confederate right, would have difficulty firing into their friends. So that's the basic idea. Cut it in half there. Now, not only is that consistent with what Long wrote, and I got to point out for anybody who's maybe not familiar with the official records and things like that, Lee and Longstreet, unfortunately, in their reports only said vague things like the attack was directed at the left center and points like that. If we had a quote that actually said, I was going at the high water mark, it would have made it a lot easier for all of us. It doesn't happen. You know, of course, the movie Gettysburg, there's that great line where Lee says, he's strengthened his flanks, in the center they will break. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any contemporary quote where Lee actually used those words, and you do this long enough and you start to forget what you saw in the movie versus what you've read in actual accounts. But again, go back to what Long says, and we think that's a pretty reasonable description, because it's not only a good description based on the terrain, but it's also going to be consistent with what actually happens. So if you look here on screen where we have Longstreet's assault, now Longstreet says that Pickett was ordered so that the center of the assaulting column would also arrive at the salient of the enemy's position. The center of the assaulting column, which is going to be basically Pettigrew's right, Trimble's right, and Pickett's left, are all going to converge, dress, and focus upon, again, that broad front on Cemetery Ridge. So not only is this idea consistent with what the guys said afterward, it's frankly, folks, it's pretty consistent with what happens on the field. Longstreet's going to place Isaac Trimble's brigades not behind Pettigrew's left, but behind Pettigrew's right. And Pettigrew and Trimble are essentially then dressing on Pickett's left so that the two forces are going to go together towards Cemetery Ridge. And that's what that map on screen is trying to represent. That's where the striking power of the attack is directed. That's where the depth of the attack is directed. Unfortunately, though, as a sidebar, that sort of deployment is going to leave the infantry flanks vulnerable as the men proceed across the field. And this is where that earlier term of concert in action comes back to play. So the cannonade, the use of artillery, Confederate artillery in this assault has a much broader and much more complex role than the simple, noisy, 2-hour spectacular fireworks show preceding the assault that we call the cannonade today. That often ridiculed notion that these guys are going to advance across 1 mile of open ground forgets the notion that Confederate artillery is not only expected to suppress Federal artillery, but the Confederate artillery is supposed to also move forward with the infantry and protect the flanks to support this assault as it goes forward. So we are not talking about a completely static artillery line, but at least some portion of the Confederate artillery is supposed to go forward with the assault, and that will help solve this problem we have about unprotected flanks. Concert of action, cooperation between the infantry and the artillery. And once you start putting all these pieces together, you start to realize this is a much more complex attack than just a simple frontal assault by George Pickett's division. So what happens? Well, we know the cannonade drags on longer than intended. Porter Alexander, commanding that portion of Longstreet's artillery, will say later, he didn't intend for it to drag on for 2 hours. He just intended for 15, 20 minutes. They thought they would overpower the Yankee artillery, but it didn't happen. And as the afternoon dragged on, Alexander couldn't find that opportunity to order the infantry, to give the green light for the infantry to go forward. And it's because of that it's going to be the Confederates who are ultimately going to expend a lot of their artillery ammunition, not going to be there to support the infantry, not going to be there to move forward when that order to attack is finally given. So, the attack itself, Longstreet's assault, Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble Charge, whatever you want to call it, Longstreet's advancing infantry would not normally be under heavy fire until they reached the Emmitsburg Road, and that's what the map here in front of you is referring to. Sort of that red, that pinkish cone coming out is representing the effective range of the Civil War rifle musket, that 350 to 400-yard range. I know if we have a reenactor in the audience, he'll tell me it's a 500-yard range, but you know the effective range is going to be about 350 or so when you get to the Emmitsburg Road. Had the Confederates suppressed the Federal artillery, much of Pickett's formations, Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble, much of their formations would have been intact. They would have been able to make the Emmitsburg Road in greater numbers, and then I do think would have been in a better position to ultimately overpower the Federal lines. It didn't happen, but that's what we think Lee is trying to do and what he's trying to get at. Now, another thing that we talk about often that because of time, I'm not going to go into great detail with here today. Remember, too, that Robert E. Lee did have other men available either to participate in the assault or to come up afterwards. Now, a lot of historians have kind of dismissed the notion of a so-called second wave, but Lee did have portions of, I think, about 5 brigades with about 5,000 men in and around Long Lane, just west of Cemetery Hill, and even Longstreet admitted in his memoirs that Hood and McLaws' divisions were supposed to spring forward into the breach if that initial assault effectively dislodged the enemy infantry. So there were other troops there, Richard Anderson's division, the remaining 3 brigades. There were other guys on the ground who were expected to be ready, to cooperate, to go in. Ultimately, when that final breach is made on Cemetery Ridge by only a handful of the beginning attackers, ultimately many of the guys involved tell us that Robert Rhodes tells us, we were looking to cooperate, the favorable moment arrived, and then the favorable moment passed. Anderson tells us, we started to mobilize my 3 brigades, and Longstreet told us to stop. So there would have been other guys, could have been other guys to support the attack, but ultimately it didn't happen. And so, as many of us know, in the wake of the attack, Robert E. Lee had one of his great leadership moments. He meets the guys as they're coming back. He tells them it was all my fault, essentially telling them, look, I asked you to do too much. I got overconfident. And that's always how we remember Lee in the wake of Pickett's Charge, accepting the blame, making himself a great leader. But in his report after the battle, which is interesting, Lee did, in writing, specifically cite On at least two occasions, he blamed the failure of the attack on his artillery. And he talks about in the report that essentially the protracted cannonade, the expenditure of our ammunition, and in one of the reports he adds a great quote, which I often use, owing to this fact, which was unknown to me when the assault took place. And I think it's probably a great example of, as the Confederates started to run low on the ammunition, I think it's one of those scenarios where nobody wanted to be the one to tell the old man, we don't have it. Nobody told them, and the attack went forward. In later years, Longstreet was often asked, look, if you didn't favor this attack, why didn't you call it off? And Longstreet often said, because Lee was on the ground, and Lee could see everything I could see. And if he wasn't going to call it off, I didn't have the discretion to call it off. Well, maybe Lee would have called it off if he realized the ammunition was expended. Lee's own report tells us nobody told me that. So that night, when Lee meets up with one of his generals and he kind of smacks his hand on the table and he says, they weren't supported. I don't know why. Too bad. What we think is, I don't think it's some North Carolina versus Virginia BS that he's really talking about. I think a lot of that did come in later. But what we think in the immediate aftermath, the concert of action had failed Lee, and Lee really said, why weren't they supported by the artillery? That hasn't been explained to me. Nobody told me they were out of ammunition. And we think that kind of puts some of the pieces together. And ultimately, as I said at the beginning, it's what's going to cause Robert E. Lee to withdraw over the next couple of days. The defeat of July 3rd is the defeat that changes everything here at Gettysburg. But I'd be remiss, of course, without talking about Lee's opponents. As General Pickett has alleged to have been said, at a dinner party one time, somebody said to General Pickett, what happened at Gettysburg? Why did you guys lose? Whose fault was it? And as the story goes, General Pickett, with a twinkle in his eye, and in those later years, Pickett, liked to have a drink or two, so he'd probably had a few. Pickett supposedly had a twinkle in his eye, said, well, I think the Yankees had something to do with it. And obviously, General Meade and the High Command's decision to stay on Cemetery Ridge, to not break and to not run, also changed everything when you come to the outcome of this battle. That's an often quoted line, by the way, but I would point out, too, that just as an FYI, that quote comes to us from Pickett's wife, Sally, who is not the most credible source of information, so let the buyer beware and proceed with caution when you want to use that one. Okay, now I think at this time, what we're going to do is, obviously we've talked about the changes in the big picture. And as I told you at the beginning, the great Wayne Motts is going to come up and talk more about some of the personal side, the individual side of it. Obviously, this charge had great impact, the defeat and the Union victory. Both sides had great impact to both armies here at Gettysburg. We think Confederate losses might have been as high as 6,000. Garnett, Armstead. Anybody know who the 3rd Brigade commander is killed in the charge? Colonel James K. Marshall, one of Pettigrew's guys nobody ever talks about. 24 years old, grandson of Chief Justice James Marshall. Nobody ever talks about him. Nobody ever talks about James Marshall. So, again, lots of losses in the Confederate Army that could have never been replaced or were not replaced, and even in the Union Army, although it's a very one-sided defeat, maybe as many as 2,000 casualties on the other side of the fence. Hancock is never the same. Cushing is lost. Lieutenant Woodruff, George Woodruff, a young artilleryman, shot in the back near the charge's close. As he's dying, he's afraid that being shot in the back would reflect somehow badly upon his character. Eliakim Sherrill, 50 years old, a former politician who raised troops, was under Hancock's rebuke for performance on July 2nd. Sherrill is killed on July 3rd, never able to sort of officially redeem himself. 10,000 people attended his funeral in Geneva, New York, a few days later. Both sides, these were, you want to talk about how the Civil War changed everything. Talk about how it changed everything for the guys who lost their lives here and their families and things that they were never going to recover from. And again, those are a lot of the human interest stories we like to tell. I'm going to turn it over to Wayne at this point right now because he's going to dive deeper into a human interest story that with some guys that I'm going to guess some of you have heard of before. So with that, the country's foremost authority on Pickett's Charge, I'm going to bring up Wayne Motts.
Thank you, tuned for station identification while we get mics on. There we go. Yes. Put that on. All right. Okay. Thank you, Jim.
If you're going to walk around, try to stay between these two trees, okay?
Okay. Try to stay in between the two trees. Anybody who knows me knows that's going to be impossible. Walking only certain places on this podium? I don't know. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jim. I want to thank Cindy and the staff at the Gettysburg Foundation for all their work here for Sacred Trust. Jim and I are honored to be here along with the other distinguished speakers this afternoon. And I appreciate this overview that Jim has given. Well, as he mentioned, one of the things that we really wanted to do is give a human side, a human connection to this. And he just mentioned some of the officers and men that lost their lives in Picketts Charge on July 3rd, 1863. So in sticking with our theme, how the Civil War changed everything, I wanted to bring out just a couple quick stories. And everybody, Jim, you missed that slide because I want everybody to see it, how you want it turned over to Shelby Foote. That's one of your best slides, and you. I thought what I would do, everybody, is just pick one story related to Picketts Charge, which we talk a little bit about in the book, but we don't fully flesh out. We do a lot of stories there, but I'm going to expand on it and talk about it, and I don't often get a chance to speak about it. I'm going to talk about the relationship today between LewisArmstead and Winfield Scott Hancock. This is a relationship that everybody wants to know. What is the true relationship between these two men? What do we know about it? What we don't know about it? What happened to them? And I'm going to address and talk about some of those today because we have a bunch of schools of thought about their friendship. Some people think they were really, really good friends, very deep and dear friends. Other people think that they weren't friends at all, that it's been completely blown up by Mrs. Hancock and completely exaggerated. And I always say, everyone, somewhere between a hook and a slice is the fairway. And that's what I'm going to show you today. They're probably the middle ground about them. So let's talk a little bit about them. Two friends on opposite sides in the American Civil War. Let's talk a little bit about LewisArmstead. The birthday of Hancock and Armstead are both in the same month. They were born 4 days difference. One on the 14th of February, Armstead on the 18th of February, but Armstead is the older man. Despite what you see in Gettysburg, the movie, despite what you read, these men did not go to West Point together. They did not come up through the ranks together. Armstead was the older man. His commission dates 5 years before Hancock gets out of West Point. And John Reynolds graduates from West Point in 1841. So they did not go to West Point together. Armstead would have been the senior of these men. Hancock being 39 here in the Battle of Gettysburg, LewisArmstead being 46 in the Battle of Gettysburg. Armstead comes from a martial military family. He had 2 uncles that died in the War of 1812. You want to guess what their names were? Lewis and Addison. Guess how our LewisArmstead got his name? He was actually named for 2 uncles who died in service fighting for their country during the War of 1812. He went to West Point, everyone, 22 months, never got out of the freshman class, plebe class at West Point. Smashed a plate over Jubal Early's head, and then realized that discretion was a better part of valor, and decided to resign from the military academy rather than be thrown out. Would he have been thrown out? Probably would have been. Was he dismissed? No, he wasn't. And his uncle was a United States congressman, and his dad was a brigadier general. If you need a job in the Army, are you going to have a problem if you're LewisArmstead? Not going to have a problem. And he gets a direct commission in 1839, and he serves from 1839 to 1861. Of course, he's mortally wounded, and he dies at the George Spangler Farm, purchased by the Gettysburg Foundation, 2008, beautifully rehabilitated. If you have not been out to the Spangler Farm, buy your ticket, get on the bus, and go out and visit this wonderful, preserved 11th Union Army Corps hospital site, despite where Armstead died. He was removed off the battlefield, and he's buried at Old St. Paul's Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland, at the same plot, ladies and gentlemen, that his uncle is buried in, the defender of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. We're going to talk a little bit about that because if you're LewisArmstead and you have to make a decision between whether you're going to stay in the United States Army or go with the Confederacy, you're going to be a conflicted person. Armstead's family were slaveholders. If Armstead was on this podium up here today, he would have no qualms telling you that he fought for slavery, that he believed in the system of slavery, that the 1830 census shows that his family held 19 slaves. They had 2 free persons of color that worked for them. In the 1840 census, they held 5 slaves and 15 free persons of color and 4 immigrants that actually worked for them at their farm outside Washington, D.C., a 323-acre farm. As far as I know, LewisArmstead owned 2 slaves, a 50-year-old woman that he bought in 1846 that he gave to his wife as a servant, his first wife, and a servant that he had with him in the regular army. He was a slaveholder. He did hold 2 slaves, and he fought for a system that preserved slavery, and he wouldn't have any qualms telling you that if he was here today. But leaving the army, leaving people he knew, leaving his chosen career, that's not going to be an easy choice for him. Let's talk a little bit about Winfield Scott Hancock, if we could. Hancock, born the same month as Armstead in 1824 in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, well over to the east of us, a graduate of West Point, and assigned to the same regiment as LewisArmstead, the 6th United States Infantry, fought in the Mexican War with LewisArmstead, became a quartermaster. If you want to get promoted, ladies and gentlemen, in the service and you're Winfield Scott Hancock, you got to get out of the line and get into a staff duty. Why does James Longstreet become master? So he can get promoted to the rank of major. Why does Hancock join the quartermaster? So he can get promoted and be paid. He obviously commands in the Civil War Brigade, Division, Corps, all the way up, and he runs for president in 1880 and dies in Governor's Island, New York, and he is buried east of here. Probably the first time that these officers met was in 1844. The first time that I can document that the 2 of them were together. They were at Fort Towson, Oklahoma, just above the Texas border. Now remember, Texas in 1845, ladies and gentlemen, is a republic. This is as far west as you can get. When Hancock graduated from West Point, there's a story told about him. Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the Army, would come and talk to the cadets there. Obviously, he's got a namesake in Winfield Scott Hancock, and he reportedly asked the future General Hancock, when you graduate from West Point, where do you want to be assigned? And he said, I want to be assigned to the company furthest on the frontier. Who in their right mind would say that? When you can get assignments in New York City, you can have a party every night, what does Hancock say? I want to sign with the company furthest on the frontier. And guess where they send him when he graduates? To Oklahoma. The furthest company on the frontier. If it's not a true story, ladies and gentlemen, it ought to be a true story. It's one of those stories that ought to be true. And that's where the 2 of them actually meet. So prior to Gettysburg, they have a relationship that is traced for 19 years. While they're in Oklahoma, they're actually roommates together, as far as I can determine, in the same little officer's hut. Here is a letter that is written by LewisArmstead. The left of that is all in Armstead's own hand. And it was written December 16th, 1845 from Fort Washita, Oklahoma. It's about 100 miles west of Fort Towson. And Armstead and Hancock are stationed there together. When Armstead wrote this letter out to a friend of his, guess whose signature and handwriting you see on the right of that page? That's General Hancock's. So Armstead is writing to one of his friends in the military telling him, here's what we're doing here. Hancock is writing on the same letter addressed there. So we know that they have a lot of interaction together. And because the government keeps great records, we can put on a timeline, okay, where are these men serving, when are they on leave, and when are they together? And they spent a considerable amount of time for regular Army officers being together because they're in the same regiment. Henry Heath tells us, Henry Heath was a member of the company after the Mexican War. He reports to duty in 1847. Who commands one of the companies of the 6th Infantry? None other than LewisArmstead. Who were the 2 lieutenants assigned under Armstead's command? Henry Heath and Winfield Scott Hancock. And this is an account from the memoirs of Winfield Scott, or of Henry Heath, I should say. And if you look down toward the bottom of this, it says, Hancock had a joke, this is with Armstead, which he often related to the officers. When Armstead was a carver, Hancock said, we will have the turkey, chicken, or duck for dinner. And Lewis would give us a very small piece and say, boys, I will take the carcass. Take the rest of the food that's there. So these men spent a good portion of time right after the Mexican War in occupation together. They spent at least 6 months there. They spent at least 2 years prior together to that. And we can trace where they are together at different military posts in St. Louis, Missouri. Hancock married a girl from St. Louis, Missouri. Myra Hancock is from St. Louis, Missouri. I don't think Armstead, as far as we know, was actually at the wedding because he was in detached service, but his family, where were they at when Hancock was married? They were at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. And Hancock was married in the home of his father-in-law, right there in that area. They're all together there. Most of the relationship that we have, what you see in Gettysburg the movie, what you read, for example, in Killer Angels, almost all of that comes from the reminiscences of Myra Hancock. Myra Hancock wrote in 1887, a year after General Hancock died, reminiscences that were published by a New York publisher. And today, we often question how accurate can some of these reminiscences and recollections be, because most of our understanding about these two men actually comes from that particular work. We do know that in 1858, the 6th Infantry altogether goes from Utah all the way out to Fort Bridger, Wyoming, and goes all the way to Sacramento, California. In 1858, they made a march of 1,000 miles during the Mormon conflict. And Armstead and Hancock would have been together at that period of time. When they arrive in Sacramento, California, Armstead and Hancock, they go at different times, but they take leave, and Hancock is originally stationed as a quartermaster in Los Angeles, California. Anybody want to guess what the population of Los Angeles, California is in 1861? 12,500. That's a good guess. Population of Gettysburg today is about what? 7,500 today? Population of LA in 1861 was 4,000 people. Military had a base there called Camp Fitzgerald, and Hancock rented a residence in downtown LA that he used as his office and his home because he could get the military to pay for the rental, right, and can live in the same section that he's actually working out of. Armstead is assigned at a place called New San Diego, California. That is San Diego, California, 135 miles south. Both of them serving on the West Coast. Armstead actually taking leave in 1860 during this critical year to go back, and he is out on leave for almost a year. He doesn't report back to Los Angeles, California, and then down to San Diego until December 26th, 1860, 6 days after South Carolina actually leaves the Union. In this critical time, they actually have a gathering of officers that are there in LA when Fort Sumter is fired upon. And this is what we know about it from the reminiscences of Myra Hancock. A lot of people want to know, some people write, is it possible for Myra Hancock to have this correct, that when Fort Sumter was fired upon, LewisArmstead, Albert Sidney Johnson, Winfield Scott Hancock, and some other officers that are going to resign and go to the east, come to their home in Los Angeles, California. She doesn't quite have all of the dates correct, but we do know that there is a window in May of 1861, using the newspapers and other military sources, where LewisArmstead, Winfield Scott Hancock, and the other person mentioned in Myra Hancock's reminiscences, that's Albert Sidney Johnson, who died at the Battle of Shiloh. There are 2 dates in May 6th through the 8th, May 18th through the 21st, 1861, that all 3 of those men are in LA, and all 3 of them could have gathered at the home of Winfield Scott Hancock. It is at this gathering, some people call it a party, it's not really a party, it's a gathering. It's at this gathering that Armstead will give Hancock a new major's uniform. Hancock doesn't actually have that major's uniform. He doesn't use it because he skips all of the ranks from captain up to brigadier general volunteers. Never needs a major's uniform, but Armstead actually gives him one as a gift. He also gives to Mrs. Hancock a small prayer book that has trust in God and fear nothing on it, an Episcopal prayer book, and he tells Mrs. Hancock that she is to keep that, and he also gives her a package that he says should be sent to his family in case anything happens to him. And when he is killed in the American Civil War, this package is sent to his sister, Cornelia Armstead, who lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and she was the wife of the brother of General John Newton that fought here at Gettysburg. So Washington Irving Newton was a military officer. She had married a Union military officer in the war, Armstead's sister. And these things were sent out to the family. They have never been found. Nobody's been able to locate them. And people also say, well, Mrs. Hancock is the only reference, really, for this gathering in Los Angeles, California. Not actually true. Let's look at this. This was a biography published about Winfield Scott Hancock in 1880. When Hancock ran for president, there were a lot of things published about him. And in this biography, published by Reverend Junkin and Frank Norton in 1880, when Hancock is running for the Democratic nomination as President of the United States, if you look up at the top, it says, here is a story related by General Hancock. So not only does Mrs. Hancock talk about this after Hancock is dead, this is published while Hancock is alive. And according to this source, Hancock himself is the source for this story. So he retells about this gathering in Los Angeles, California, about the new major's uniform, and that Armstead gives Mrs. Hancock. He does not give that to Mrs. Hancock at any other time, ladies and gentlemen. He doesn't give it to Longstreet in a tent like you see it in Gettysburg, the movie. He actually gives this package to Mrs. Hancock in Los Angeles, California. This is an account from 1880, clearly while Hancock is living. And then here are the two people that these items go to. So that's Armstead's sister over there on the left, Cornelia, and that's Washington Irving Newton, the brother of General John Newton, the commander of the First Corps here in the Battle of Gettysburg that Frank O'Reilly mentioned earlier today, if you heard that speech. And I put this in, my colleague Paul Bailey will be very happy that I put something in about, about John Newton that's here. These are the people that actually get the personal belongings. You're LewisArmstead, folks. This is a hard decision for you. If you want to resign from military service, all your life you've prepared and trained to do one thing, to lead men in combat. That's what Armstead and Hancock are both doing here on July 3rd, 1863. The only friends and family you have are the friends and family you have from the United States military if you're LewisArmstead. Armstead was 38 years old and a widower twice over in 1855 by the time he was 38 years old. So I don't know what relationship he had with Mrs. Hancock. I don't think it's the one you see on TV. I think Mrs. Hancock is about the only lady that's been a pretty constant in his life, someone that he can see that is a peer, and she is younger, considerably younger than he is, but a peer that he can speak to. He doesn't have a lot of interaction with his sisters. Armstead has to make tough choices, and he does not leave the military until May of 1861. He's like Robert E. Lee. He's got to make the tough choices. We know on April 17, Virginia has the Ordinance of Succession. They don't have a public vote until May of that year, and Armstead waits till May to actually resign his commission as a United States Army officer. Now why? Well, not only does he have all those close ties to the family, but he also has a family connected to the American flag. This is George Armstead, everybody. Armstead's uncle, LewisArmstead's uncle. The flag that you see at the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum of American History today, that flew over Fort McHenry in September of 1814 when Francis Scott Key drafted the Star-Spangled Banner. When he wrote that, that flag came right out of the Armstead family. How did the Smithsonian get it? The Armstead family had it. In 1907, right there it is. It was put on loan to the Smithsonian Institution in 1907. It was given to the Smithsonian by the Armstead family in 1912. When Armstead is on leave, one of the places he goes is to his next door neighbor in Fauquier County, Virginia, 45 miles west of Washington, D.C. Anybody know who Armstead's next door neighbor was? Closest you can get on the farm? How about General Turner Ashby of the Confederate Army? Was Armstead's neighbor. And there's an account of the two of them sitting on the porch in 1860 because Turner Ashby was at John Brown's hanging. He's talking about John Brown's hanging. And he's very concerned about the division of the country. And Armstead tells him, you can see it at the bottom, Turner, do not talk so. I know but one country and one flag. Let me sing you a song and drive away your gloom. And then they sang the Star-Spangled Banner together. And the Star-Spangled Banner was all wrapped around Armstead's entire family. So when he has to make this call to leave the Union, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be a tough call for him, just like it was for Robert E. Lee. Mrs. Hancock says that there were many conferences held in their house. We do know that Richard Garnett spent time in the Hancock home. We can confirm that in October of 1860. We know Armstead's there a couple times. She mentions Pickett. We can't really document that, but he was stationed on the West Coast. There's no question that some of these men came to Hancock and asked Hancock for advice. Hancock was no abolitionist. Hancock was a solid Democrat. He had married a woman from a slave state, the state of Missouri. He would have been very conservative, but he told all the people that, according to Mrs. Hancock, the quote that you see at the bottom of this slide, "I can give you no advice, as I shall not fight upon the principles of states' rights, but for the Union whole and undivided." So when these Southerners went to Hancock, he made it very clear to them where he was going to stand when it came time for the country to choose sides. Armstead has a hard time, I think, making that choice, but he does make it in favor for the Confederacy. Armstead may be one of the only officers in the Confederate Army that joined the Confederate Army that was a resigned Union Army officer that actually resigned twice. He actually has 2 letters of resignation. This is the first one that dates to May 13, 1861. Now that is after Virginia had the Ordinance of Secession and before they actually had the public vote, which is around May 23rd, I think, public vote for Virginia. This is the first letter of resignation that he had. He resigned May 13th. And that resignation was not accepted. It went up through channels, and then he resigned on May 26th. Why? Because he absenced himself from his own command, got on a boat, went to LA, went to San Francisco, and wrote this letter out at Department of Pacific headquarters without getting any authority to leave his command. And the department commander, Edwin Vo Sumner, was so upset with him, he refused to accept this resignation and told Armstead, "You got to go back down to San Diego." So Armstead got on a boat, went back to LA, went to San Diego, went all the way down there and wrote his resignation letter out again. So if you go to the National Archives, he's actually got 2 of them. We don't have to guess why LewisArmstead fought for the Confederacy. We know why. We know in his own words why. And here is a letter that he wrote on December 2nd, 1861, near Richmond, as the colonel of the 57th Virginia Volunteer Infantry Regiment, writing to get a cadetship, an officership for his son, Walker Keith Armstead, in the Confederate Army. Walker Keith Armstead, his son, was 18 years old in the Battle of Gettysburg as his aide-de-camp. And in 1861, when this boy is just about 16 years old, Armstead is trying to get him a cadet appointment in what they were going to organize, almost like a military academy for the Confederacy. And he says this, right where the arrow is in the slide. This is all in his own hand. "I was an officer in the Army of the U.S., which service I left to fight for my own country and for and with my own people, and because they were right and oppressed." Because they were right and oppressed. We don't have to guess why LewisArmstead joined the Confederacy in the Civil War. We know why. Because he thought that that section of the country, his state, had followed a correct course of action and they were being oppressed by the northern states. That's why he joined. It's not going to be an easy choice for him. And the friend he leaves behind is the best friend he probably had, Winfield Scott Hancock. And then that fateful day comes on July 3rd, 1863, 153 years ago this day, at about right now, pretty close to the time, because they didn't have daylight savings time back in those days, that's there. And those 2 men are going to be opposite each other, one on Seminary Ridge and one on Cemetery Ridge. That's there. Armstead will cross this stone wall. He will be mortally wounded at this spot. And if you look back here behind, you look in the distance, way in the back portion of this slide, way off in the distance, I don't know if I can point to it, you'll see the memorial to where General Hancock was wounded. These 2 men were wounded at about the same time on July 3rd, 1863, several hundred yards apart from each other. Armstead is wounded in the center up by the angle. This is the memorial today that marks that spot. And then he is carried off the battlefield, ladies and gentlemen, by several privates. He is stopped, as luck would have it, by a captain named Henry H. Bingham, an aide, a staff officer to none other than General Winfield Scott Hancock. And when he stops this party of men carrying Armstead off the battlefield, he said, "Who do you have there?" You know who they say they had? They say they had General Longstreet. This is why if you read all the early accounts, General Longstreet is the one that's captured on the Gettysburg battlefield, not at LewisArmstead. Well, they got it wrong. It's LewisArmstead. And of course, Captain Bingham says, "Put the men down." And then he stops the stretcher and he says, "I'm Captain Bingham, General Hancock's staff." And Armstead inquires, "Is that General Winfield Scott Hancock?" And Bingham says, "Yes, it is." And then Armstead says that Hancock was an old and valued friend. Those were Armstead's words to Bingham. In 1869, Winfield Scott Hancock writes to Henry H. Bingham and says, what were the circumstances of Armstead's wounding and what were the circumstances of how I got Armstead's personal belongings. And in 1869, 6 years after Pickett's Charge, Bingham writes this account out in a letter that ended up in the John Batchelder papers. This was a letter to Winfield Scott Hancock because Hancock wants to know what the circumstances of this are. There was a painting done in 1870 by artist James Walker, commissioned by John Batchelder, the government historian, and this scene of Bingham getting personal belongings from LewisArmstead, because Bingham says, do you have anything personal you want to give me? I'll take care of it. And Armstead turned over his watch, his pocketbook, his spur, his seal, private items that went to General Hancock. And in this 1869 letter, Bingham tells General Hancock that he gave Hancock those items 15 minutes after General Hancock was wounded, lying in an ambulance at a field hospital in the woods directly behind Pickett's Charge. I think this is where the Garnett schoolhouse is today. It's where that location was. And Armstead was taken to the 11th Army Corps Hospital, as I mentioned earlier, the George Spangler Farm. These men did not see each other. Armstead and Hancock did not see each other while they were wounded. They were not in the same hospital. They were probably in hospitals several hundred yards apart. Then Hancock is actually moved to the 2nd Army Corps Hospital near Rock Creek. Then he's moved down to Westminster. He's taken down to Baltimore, then over to Philadelphia, then over to Norristown. And then he goes out to Missouri for recovery at his in-laws' home and is out of action for, 6 months, 7 months or more before he actually get into action. This scene that Walker puts in the painting is really the impetus design for the Friend-to-Friend Masonic Memorial that was put up in 1993 by sculptor Ron Tunison. This is Captain Bingham, wounded in the head. You see a bandage around his head, taking the personal belongings of General LewisArmstead. And of course, Armstead is taken out to the Spangler Farm. This is the restored image. This isn't the completely restored image. I have to go out. They're doing such great work out there. I need to go out there about every weekend to take another photograph of something. This photograph is a little older that's here, but this is one with all the modern buildings removed. Armstead was taken, we believe, into the summer kitchen of the house. That's where he died on July 5th, 1863, and as I mentioned, he is buried down in Baltimore, Maryland. And his final grave is right there. So Hancock survives this wound, devastating wound, plagues him really for the rest of his life. He does stay in the regular army, and he dies of complications of diabetes in 1886 and is buried in Norristown, Pennsylvania. This is the story about two men that had a friendship that could be traced back 2 decades, that because of their opposite stances in the Civil War end up opposite sides. And as fate would hold, both of them in command of troops this fateful day, July 3rd, 1863, both wounded about a couple hundred yards from each other, one dying, one surviving here. I often wonder if Armstead would have survived, what would have happened after the war. He would have gone back, he would talk to Hancock. I'm certain that this friendship would have lasted those bonds. These aren't the only friends in the war. Keep in mind, James Longstreet is friends with U.S. Grant. Tom Rosser, Confederate cavalry officer, friends with George Armstrong Custer. There's many examples we could use between friends in the Civil War. But the one that everybody reads about, the one that Bruce Catton talks about when he did his history, the one that's in Killer Angels and Gettysburg the movie, the one that really defines friendships broken in the Civil War is this relationship. And there's a lot we don't know about it, but there's a lot we do know about it. And you just got the Cliff Note version of it over the last 5 minutes that's there. But I think it's really a great story. We tend to focus on the large aspects of the war. We need to focus on that. The Civil War had such a tremendous impact on the lives that you and I lead today. We can't understate that. The 13th, the 14th, 15th Amendment to the Constitution coming out of the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, the road to civil rights, the land grant colleges, that my own college, I went to school, a land grant college because of the Civil War, the Pacific Railroad, all of that coming out of the Civil War. So many things we couldn't talk about it. But sometimes when we're looking at the big picture, we forget that there are people involved, the smaller picture. And hopefully one of the things that we came through in the book is to make those stories real for you when we talk about Pickett's Charge for July 3rd, 1863. And I put the last slide in here, I think, if I got it somewhere. It just kind of summarizes what Jim and I did. The 4 tours the maps, the photos, the stories, and everything that we did there. And under shameless self-promotion, we will be signing immediately after this talk if anybody wants to get copies. And Jim and I will take a few can we take a couple questions? Do we have time, Cindy? Okay, we do. All right, we'll take a couple questions. Thank you. Jim can be here. He's good. Finished on time. Let's see, and we can always answer more in there. You want to lead out, Jim? Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that Hancock was promoted from captain to brigadier general. One curiosity I always have is in the regular Army, if you compare the regular Army, like the 6th U.S. Infantry
Right.
versus the volunteer infantry, I know commanders are promoted from like captain to general. Do they consider volunteer infantry like second rate compared to the U.S. infantry regiments?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think if you ask, there's a letter that General Buford wrote that said he would much rather command regular troops. If you ask any regular Army soldier, he would much rather, if you ask Hancock and Armstead, I'm sure if they were here today, would you rather command volunteers or regular Army troops? They're going to tell you they would rather command regular Army troops because of the discipline that's there. Now, in the Civil War, you can hold different ranks. When John Reynolds is killed out here on July 1, he's killed as a Major General of the Volunteers, but he's the colonel of the 5th United States Infantry Regiment. So he has a linear rank. Hancock doesn't have to give up his linear rank in the U.S. regular Army. He gets regular promotions in the regular Army, too. At the beginning of the war, there were rules that if you took a volunteer commission, you had to give up your regular Army commission, and they couldn't get anybody to go in the volunteers to do the training, so they did away with that. You can hold 8 different ranks in the Civil War. You can hold 4 in regular Army, volunteers, militia, and reserves, and you can hold an honorary rank in each one of those 4. You can't do that today. You can't be a member of the National Guard and the U.S. regular Army at the same time. In the Civil War, you could. You could. So it's kind of an odd thing. Yeah.
What do you think?
You ready to go? Go ahead. Yeah.
You hear a lot today about the second wave of Picketts Charge, and you mentioned a little bit about that in your talk earlier on. And I'm just wondering, do you think, since Longstreet was technically in charge of the assault, do you think Longstreet ever seriously considered sending in the second wave? I mean, it seems to me that when he saw Brockenbar's brigade falter, that he was already giving up on it, and of course the second wave never happens, and it's one of these things that kind of rankles some of us.
I think that's a fair assessment. Just speaking for myself personally, I tend to not think Longstreet seriously thought about it. You know, there's a great story where he's sitting there talking to Arthur Fremantle, and one of Pickett's staff officers comes over looking for support. And while the staff officer comes in, Longstreet's in the process of telling Fremantle, you know, the charge has failed, it's over. And then kind of grudgingly, Longstreet seems to tell the staff officer to go over and send Wilcox and Lang in. So, you know, and then afterwards, subsequently, like I mentioned a little bit during my talk, you know, both R.H. Anderson, I think Wright, Robert Rhodes, they all make comments to the effect of, well, we were told to look for a general opportunity, and I think in Anderson's case specifically says we started to mobilize and General Longstreet told us not to, that the attack had failed. So I think the short answer is I would tend to agree with you. I think Longstreet probably realized it would be too little too late and didn't do that. So.
Yeah, and think about what a difficult decision that had to be on Armstead's part, because he knows that the men up in front of there are probably going to wonder what's happening to these men, and we know the accounts of here. This has got to be tough for him to be able to do that. And did he make the right call given the circumstances? I think he made the right call, in my opinion. Yeah.
Hard to argue with it.
Yeah.
How much do you think the land?
We got to do more on that. We get assault.
We do get assault.
Yeah.
How much do you think the land, the field has changed because of the World War I tank course? And whatever else has gone on throughout the years.
Yeah, there's been all kinds of stuff out there. The 1913 Great Camp, Camp Colt, the POW camp in World War II. Yeah, to Wayne's point, we do get asked that question all the time. Wayne, would you like to field that one?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Well, we might have different opinion
We might
on
have
it. That's
different
true.
opinions.
There's no question that items were, areas were graded out there. Most of the buildings were above grade. There were pipes that were put in. There was a pool put out there. But how many tanks were out there? As far as I know, 2. Only 2 tanks running out there, Picketts Charge. So is it appreciably changed? I don't believe it's appreciably changed, to use those words. Considerably changed, I would say no. Is it changed? Yes. If you're a soldier in Picketts Charge and you get an extra 2 feet of cover walking across that field, that's important to you. No question about that. But I think it pretty much looks like it did during the time of the battle. I think the undulations are what they are, and they may have been more pronounced during the attack, but not radically different, in my opinion.
Yeah, we had a gentleman one time suggest that we should take the topography of the Warren map and overlay that with GPS and satellite photography to see how the undulations have changed. We have not done that.
It'd be something to do, but then we have our commercial satellites that we have. It's not like a military satellite, so there's always like so many different meter variations.
Right.
There's always the error.
I see some guys on the fourth
Yeah,
row
maybe
who I
the
think
map
would like
guys
to,
can
would
work
like
on
to
it.
take,
We know
take
some
that
map
one
guys
on.
here that might
Yeah.
have to work on that.
One more.
Take one
Yeah,
more?
We got one more.
Okay.
Just a local question, but is there any evidence that General Hancock was ever cared for at the David Bill's house? I read that somewhere.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Is Hancock, any evidence that Hancock was cared for at the Wills house?
Is there evidence at the will? I think, I don't know of him being cared for at the Wills house, but he did move around to a number of different locations. So I can't say yes or no on that because I don't know enough to know about that. I know he was treated in the temporary hospital. Then I know he went to the division hospitals of the 2nd Corps, which are on Rock Creek. And then from there, he was taken down to Westminster. But he was taken down to Westminster like that night or the next day. So he was taken very shortly thereafter. So I'm not sure about that because I just don't know how he'd be able to get up there in that, because he'd still be under Confederate occupation. So I would doubt that he could be taken there.
And on that note, the lovely ladies of the Gettysburg Foundation are giving us this. So we're going to go
Gotta
into
get
sign
out.
books, and hopefully we will see some of you in there. Thank you.
Thank you.